By the time Thomas Callahan turned 58, he had learned to live with silence, not the peaceful kind, not the comfortable quiet that settles over a home after a long day. This was a heavy silence, the kind that followed him through diners in Ohio, church halls in Indiana, and retirement mixers in Sarasota, Florida. The silence after a first date, the silence after an awkward pause, the silence after the look. Tom sat alone in a corner booth at Marge's diner, the same booth he'd occupied every Tuesday and Thursday morning for the past 3 years. His coffee had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but he hadn't noticed. His attention was fixed on the window, watching the parking lot fill with a morning rush. A couple in their 60s walked past, holding hands. The woman laughed at something her husband said, leaning into him with the ease of decades spent together. Tom watched them disappear through the front door, heard them greet the waitress by name, listened to them settle into a booth across the restaurant. He looked down at his coffee. Cold, bitter, forgotten. The waitress approached with a fresh pot. Warm that up for you, Tom. He nodded without looking up. Thank you, Linda. She poured, lingered for a moment, then moved on. She had learned years ago that Tom wasn't much for morning conversation. He was polite, always polite, but there was something about him that kept people at arm's length. Not coldness, exactly. More like a fence built so carefully that most people didn't even notice it was there. Tom wrapped his hands around the warm mug and watched the steam rise. 58 years old, retired civil engineer, widowed for nearly a decade. He had built bridges in his career, literal bridges, structures that connected one place to another, that carried people safely across impossible distances. He had been good at his job, respected, relied upon, but he had never figured out how to build a bridge to another person. Not since Eleanor died. The morning light shifted through the window, casting long rectangles across the linoleum floor. Tom finished his coffee, left a generous tip, and walked out into the Florida humidity. His apartment was a 15-minute drive from the diner, a modest one-bedroom in a quiet complex filled mostly with retirees. He had chosen it for its anonymity. No one knew his history here. No one asked questions. He could exist in the margins, unnoticed and unbothered. He parked in his usual spot, climbed a single flight of stairs, and unlocked his door. The apartment was exactly as he had left it. Clean, sparse, a couch facing a television he rarely watched, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, though only one had ever been used, a bedroom with a neatly made bed and a photograph of Eleanor on the nightstand. Tom stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the photograph. She had been 51 when she died. Cancer, the kind that moves fast, gives no warning, offers no negotiation. One day they were planning a trip to the Grand Canyon. 6 months later, he was standing in a cemetery, holding a folded flag, listening to words that meant nothing. That was almost 10 years ago now. He had tried dating again. His sister had insisted. His friends had encouraged. Even his doctor, during a routine checkup, had gently suggested that companionship might be good for his health. So Tom had tried. The first woman was a retired teacher named Dolores. They had met at a church potluck, talk about books and grandchildren, exchange phone numbers. 3 dates in, things seemed promising. She laughed at his jokes. She touched his arm when she spoke. She suggested they spend a weekend together at her cabin in the mountains. Tom had been honest with her. He believed in honesty. Before things progressed too far, he had told her what he thought she needed to know. The next morning, Dolores was gone. She left a note on the kitchen counter. You're a wonderful man, Tom. You deserve someone special. He never heard from her again. The second woman was a widow named Patricia. They had met through a grief support group. She understood loss. She understood silence. For a while, Tom thought maybe that would be enough. It wasn't. When the moment came, when truth could no longer be avoided, Patricia's face changed. Not disgust, exactly, more like fear. She made an excuse about an early morning appointment and left before midnight. Her text the next day was brief. I'm just not ready for a relationship right now. The third woman didn't even make it that far. Someone had warned her. Small towns have long memories, and rumors travel faster than truth. She canceled their second date with a vague excuse about family obligations. Tom stopped counting after that. He learned to recognize the signs. The subtle shift in a woman's posture. The way her eyes would change when conversation turned toward intimacy. The careful, rehearsed phrases designed to let him down gently. You deserve someone special. I'm just not ready. It's not you, it's me. But it was him. It was always him. Or rather, it was always his body. The thing he had been born with. The thing he could not change, could not hide, could not explain away. Tom had spent his whole adult life being reduced to a rumor about his own body. He sat down on the edge of his bed and looked at Eleanor's photograph. She was smiling in the picture, her hair still brown, her eyes still bright. They had been married for 26 years. She had known everything about him. She had accepted everything about him. And she had loved him anyway. How did you do it? He asked the photograph. How did you look at me and not see a problem? The photograph didn't answer. It never did. Tom's phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from his sister. Carol, call me when you get a chance. Have an idea you might like. He set the phone down without responding. Carol's ideas usually involved setting him up with someone, a friend of a friend, a woman from her church, a widow she had met at a charity auction. Carol meant well. She always meant well. But she didn't understand. No one did. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the parking lot below. An elderly man was helping his wife out of their car, steadying her with a gentle hand on her elbow. They moved slowly, carefully, together. Tom watched until they disappeared into the building. The community center was a low brick building on the edge of downtown Sarasota. Tom volunteered there 3 days a week, helping with whatever needed doing. Sometimes he organized supply closets. Sometimes he set up chairs for meetings. Sometimes he just sat with the older veterans, listening to their stories, offering silent companionship. Today, he was sorting donations in the back room. Boxes of canned goods, bags of clothing, stacks of paperback books. Mindless work that kept his hands busy and his thoughts quiet. A man named Henry found him there around noon. Henry was 82, a Korean War veteran with a bad hip and a sharp sense of humor. He shuffled into the back room with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Tom. You look like you could use this, Henry said, settling into a folding chair. Tom accepted the cup. That obvious. Son, I've been reading faces since before you were born. Something's eating at you. Tom shrugged. Just tired. Tired of what? The question hung in the air. Tom didn't answer right away. He focused on the box in front of him, pulling out cans of soup and stacking them on a shelf. Tired of trying, he finally said. Henry nodded slowly, as if he understood more than Tom had said. Trying to do what? Connect with someone. Start over. All the things people say you're supposed to do after you lose your wife. And it's not working. Tom laughed, but there was no humor in it. You could say that. Henry sipped his coffee. You know what I've learned in 82 years? People are scared of what they don't understand. Most folks, they want love to be simple, easy, predictable. When it's not, they run. So what do? You wait. You wait for someone who's not looking for easy. Someone who's lived enough life to know that simple doesn't exist. Tom considered this. What if that person doesn't exist? Henry smiled. She exists. You just haven't found her yet. That night, Tom's phone buzzed again. Carol, calling this time instead of texting. He let it ring twice before answering. Hey, Carol. Tom, I've been trying to reach you all day. Did you get my text? I got it. And he sighed. What's the idea? There's a book club in St. Augustine. A friend of mine started it a few months ago. Mostly people our age, maybe a little older. They meet every other week, discuss novels, drink wine. Very low pressure. I'm not much of a joiner, Carol. I know, but this isn't about joining. It's about getting out of that apartment, being around people. You don't have to date anyone. You don't have to impress anyone. Just show up, read a book, have a conversation. Tom was quiet for a long moment. St. Augustine is over 2 hours away. So make a day of it. Visit the old fort. Walk around downtown. You used to love that town. She was right. He and Eleanor had spent their 20th anniversary in St. Augustine. They had walked the narrow streets, toured the lighthouse, eaten dinner at a restaurant overlooking the water. It had been one of their happiest trips. I don't know, Carol. Tom. Her voice softened. I'm not asking you to fall in love. I'm asking you to stop hiding. That's all. Just stop hiding. He closed his eyes. I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking. After he hung up, Tom sat in the darkness of his living room, listening to the silence. The heavy, familiar silence that had been his companion for nearly a decade. Maybe Carol was right. Maybe he had been hiding, building fences so carefully that he had trapped himself inside them. He thought about Henry's words, waiting for someone who wasn't looking for easy, someone who had lived enough life to know that simple doesn't exist. Maybe that person was out there, maybe she wasn't. But sitting alone in this apartment, watching life happen through windows, wasn't going to help him find out. Tom picked up his phone and texted Carol. Send me the details. I'll go. Her response came immediately. 3 words that felt heavier than they should have. I'm so proud. Tom set the phone down and looked at Eleanor's photograph on the nightstand. One more try, he whispered. Just one more. The photograph didn't answer. But for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. Chapter 2, Margaret. St. Augustine looked exactly the same as Tom remembered. The narrow streets, the old Spanish architecture, the way the light seemed softer here, filtered through salt air and centuries of history. He and Eleanor had walked these same sidewalks 15 years ago, holding hands, dreaming about the future. Now he walked them alone. The book club met at a small community center near the waterfront, a converted church with high ceilings and tall windows that let in the afternoon light. Tom arrived 20 minutes early, partly from habit and partly from nervousness. He sat in his car for 10 of those minutes, watching people trickle in through the front door. They looked like him, older, weathered by time and experience. Some walked with canes. Others moved with the careful deliberation of people who had learned not to rush. A few arrived in pairs, but most came alone. Tom took a deep breath and got out of the car. The inside of the building was warm and welcoming. Folding chairs had been arranged in a loose circle. A table along the wall held coffee, tea, and a modest spread of cookies and crackers. Soft music played from somewhere, something classical that Tom didn't recognize. A woman in her 70s approached him with a warm smile. First time. That's obvious. You have that look, like you're not sure if you're in the right place. She extended her hand. I'm Doris. I help run things around here. Welcome. Tom Callahan. Well, Tom Callahan, grab yourself some coffee and find a seat. We don't bite. Most of us, anyway. He managed a small smile and made his way to the refreshment table. The coffee was stronger than he expected, which he appreciated. He filled a paper cup and turned to survey the room. About 15 people had gathered so far. Some were chatting in small groups. Others sat alone, books in hand, waiting for the meeting to begin. Tom chose a chair near the back, close to the door in case he needed to make a quick exit. He had just settled in when she walked through the door. She was tall. That was the first thing he noticed. Tall and straight-backed, with silver-streaked hair pulled loosely away from her face. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a worn paperback in one hand. Her eyes scanned the room with quiet confidence, taking everything in without lingering on anything. Then her gaze landed on Tom. It was only a moment, a fraction of a second, but something in her expression shifted, softened, before she looked away and moved toward the refreshment table. Tom watched her pour a cup of tea. She added honey, stirred slowly, exchanged a few words with Doris. When she laughed at something Doris said, it was full-bodied and unashamed, the kind of laugh that came from somewhere deep. She chose a seat across the circle from Tom, close enough that he could see her clearly, far enough that they wouldn't be forced into conversation. She opened her book and began reading, seemingly unaware of his attention. But Tom had a feeling she was very aware. The meeting began a few minutes later. Doris called everyone to order and introduced a book they would be discussing, a novel about a widower who reconnects with an old flame at his 50th high school reunion. The irony wasn't lost on Tom. The discussion was lively but respectful. People shared opinions about the characters, debated the author's choices, related the story to their own experiences. Tom mostly listened, speaking only when directly asked for his thoughts. But he kept finding his attention drifting to the woman in blue. Her name, he learned when she spoke, was Margaret. Margaret Lewis. She was thoughtful in her observations, choosing her words carefully but never seeming uncertain. When she disagreed with someone, she did so gently, acknowledging their perspective before offering her own. I think the author is saying that love doesn't have an expiration date, Margaret said at one point. We spend so much time believing we've missed our chance. But maybe the real tragedy isn't missing the chance. It's convincing ourselves we don't deserve another one. The room fell quiet for a moment. Several people nodded. Tom found himself nodding too. After the meeting ended, people lingered. Small conversations formed around the refreshment table. Tom refilled his coffee, more for something to do than because he wanted it. He was preparing to leave when a voice stopped him. "You're new here." He turned. Margaret stood a few feet away, her teacup held in both hands. "First meeting," he confirmed. "What did you think? The book or the discussion?" "Either. Both." Tom considered the question. The book was hopeful, maybe too hopeful, but the discussion was good. People here seemed to actually listen to each other. Margaret smiled. "That's rare these days, isn't it? Actual listening." "It is." She extended her hand. "Margaret Lewis." "Tom Callahan." Her handshake was firm and warm. She held his gaze as they shook, and Tom felt something he hadn't felt in years. Seen. Not looked at, but actually seen. "What brings you to St. Augustine, Tom Callahan? You don't sound local." "I'm not. I live in Sarasota. My sister suggested I try this group. Said I needed to get out more." "And do you need to get out more?" Tom laughed despite himself. "According to everyone who knows me, yes." "Well, I hope you'll come back. It's a good group, and we could use some fresh perspectives." "I'll think about it." Margaret nodded, as if she understood that think about it meant more than it sounded. "It was nice meeting you, Tom." "You too, Margaret." She turned and walked toward the door, pausing to say goodbye to a few people along the way. Tom watched her leave, then stood alone in the emptying room, holding a cup of coffee he didn't want. He thought about it the entire drive back to Sarasota. 2 weeks later, he returned to St. Augustine. This time, he arrived only 10 minutes early. He found a seat closer to the middle of the circle, and when Margaret walked in, he didn't look away when she caught his eye. She smiled and chose a seat next to him. "You came back," she said. "I did." "I'm glad." The book that week was about a woman who left a successful career to care for her aging mother. The discussion turned to sacrifice, duty, and the things people give up for the ones they love. Tom found himself speaking more than he had the first time. Margaret listened when he talked, really listened, leaning slightly toward him as if his words mattered. After the meeting, she asked if he wanted to get coffee. They walked to a small cafe 3 blocks from the community center. The place was quiet, only a few other patrons scattered among the tables. They found a booth by the window and ordered. Coffee for him, tea for her. "So," Margaret said, wrapping her hands around her cup, "tell me about yourself, Tom Callahan. What do you want to know?" "Whatever you want to share." It was an unusual response. Most people ask specific questions. "Where are you from? What did you do for work? Are you married?" Margaret left the door open and let him choose what to walk through. "I was a civil engineer," he said. "Bridges, mostly. Retired about 5 years ago. Before that, I was married. 26 years. She passed away almost a decade ago. Cancer." Margaret nodded slowly. "I'm sorry." "Thank you. My husband and I divorced 12 years ago. 28 years of marriage, and one day I realized I couldn't remember the last time I was happy in it. So I left. Started over. It was the hardest thing I've ever done." "Do you regret it? The marriage or the leaving?" "Either. Both." She smiled at having her own words returned to her. "I don't regret the leaving. I regret how long I waited to do it. I regret the years I spent convincing myself that unhappy was the same as safe. Tom understood that more than she knew. They talked for 2 hours. About grief and loneliness. About the strange challenge of being alone after decades of partnership. About the way people looked at you differently when you were older and single, as if you were a problem waiting to be solved. People keep trying to fix me, Tom admitted. My sister, especially. She thinks if she can just find the right woman, everything will fall into place. And what do you think? He was quiet for a moment. I think some things can't be fixed. They can only be lived with. Margaret studied him. Her eyes were kind but searching, as if she was looking for something beneath the surface. You sound like someone who's been hurt, she said softly. I suppose I have. By your wife's death. By a lot of things. She didn't push. She simply nodded and sipped her tea, letting the silence settle between them. It wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like a relief, like being with someone who understood that not every moment needed to be filled with words. When they finally parted outside the cafe, Margaret touched his arm. Same time in 2 weeks. I'll be here. Good. She walked away, and Tom stood on the sidewalk watching her go. The evening light caught her silver hair, making it glow. He drove back to Sarasota with the windows down, letting the salt air wash over him. The weeks became months. Tom and Margaret saw each other at every book club meeting. Coffee afterward became a standing tradition. Then the coffee became dinners. The dinners became long walks along the waterfront, watching the sunset over the old fort. They talked about everything. Books and childhood summers. Failed dreams and unexpected blessings. The weight of growing older and the strange freedom that came with it. Tom told her about Eleanor. The way they had met at a college football game. Their modest wedding in his parents' backyard. The house they had built together outside Columbus. The life they had planned in the years that were stolen. Margaret told him about her marriage, the slow erosion of love, the nights spent sleeping in separate rooms, the final argument that ended not with shouting but with silence, the terrifying exhilaration of starting over at 4 to 9. I thought I was too old to reinvent myself, she said one evening as they sat on a bench overlooking the harbor. Turns out, you're never too old. You're just scared. And now I'm less scared. Not fearless. Just less scared. Tom understood. He felt it too, this slow thawing of something that had been frozen for years. But even as he grew closer to Margaret, a familiar fear began to stir, the fear of truth. Because sooner or later, every relationship arrived at the same place. The moment when words weren't enough. The moment when bodies became part of the conversation. And Tom knew what happened at that moment. He had lived it too many times to forget. Margaret seemed content with their pace. She never pushed for more. She never suggested they spend nights together or move the relationship toward anything physical. In some ways, that made it easier. In other ways, it made it harder. Because the longer they waited, the more Tom had to lose. He began noticing things. Small things. Things that probably meant nothing, but that he couldn't stop turning over in his mind. Margaret never invited him to her home. They always met in public places, restaurants, cafes, parks, the waterfront. When he suggested cooking dinner together, she deflected. When he asked about her apartment, she changed the subject. At first, he assumed she was just private. Some people were. Eleanor had been private about certain things too. But there was something else. A hesitation in Margaret's voice when he talked about Eleanor. A flicker of something in her eyes when the conversation turned too personal. He told himself he was imagining things, projecting his own fears onto someone who had given him no reason to doubt her. But the questions lingered. One evening in early July, they sat on their usual bench. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. A group of children ran past, chasing each other with sparklers left over from an early Independence Day celebration. Margaret watched them with a soft smile. I always wanted children. Never had them. One of my regrets. Eleanor and I tried, Tom said quietly, for years. It never happened. Eventually we stopped trying and focused on each other. I think she was relieved. In a way. She said I was enough for her. Was she enough for you? More than enough. Margaret turned to look at him. Her eyes searched his face, looking for something he couldn't identify. You loved her very much. I did. And since her? The question hung in the air. Tom felt his chest tighten. Since her, I've tried, but it hasn't worked out. Why not? He didn't answer. Not because he didn't know, but because he wasn't ready to say it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Margaret seemed to sense his hesitation. She reached over and placed a hand on his. You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share. I'm not going anywhere. Tom looked at her hand on his. Small and warm. Steady. How do you know? He asked. Know what? That you're not going anywhere. How can you be sure? Margaret smiled, but there was something behind it. Something he couldn't quite read. Because I've been where you are. And I know what it feels like to be afraid that the truth will drive someone away. She squeezed his hand and turned back to watch the sunset. Tom sat beside her, silent, wondering what she meant, wondering what truth she was hiding, wondering if he would ever be brave enough to share his own. The fireworks started somewhere in the distance, explosions of color against the darkening sky. Margaret leaned slightly toward him, close enough that he could smell her perfume. For a moment, everything felt possible, but the fear was still there, waiting, patient, knowing that sooner or later, truth always arrived. And when it did, Tom would find out if Margaret was different from all the others, or if she would disappear like everyone else. He hoped, desperately, that she would stay, but hope had failed him before. The weeks that followed were the happiest Tom had known since Eleanor's death. He and Margaret fell into a rhythm. Book club every other Tuesday. Coffee afterward that stretched into dinner. Long walks along the waterfront where they talked about everything and nothing. Phone calls that lasted hours, her voice warm in his ear as he sat alone in his Sarasota apartment. For the first time in nearly a decade, Tom felt like himself again. Not the broken widower. Not the man with the shameful secret. Just Tom, a man who laughed at bad jokes and enjoyed strong coffee and looked forward to tomorrow. But beneath the happiness, fear waited. It was always there, a shadow at the edge of every good moment, a whisper that reminded him how every relationship before had ended. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. Connection, growing closeness, the inevitable moment of truth. Rejection. Tom knew it was coming. He could feel it approaching like a storm on the horizon. The only question was when. July arrived hot and humid, the kind of Florida summer that made the air feel thick enough to drink. Tom drove to St. Augustine on a Saturday, earlier than usual. Margaret had suggested they spend the day together before the evening's delayed 4th of July celebration at the pier. They walked through the old town, ducking into air-conditioned shops to escape the heat. Margaret bought a scarf she didn't need. Tom bought a book he would probably never read. They ate lunch at a small restaurant overlooking the water, sharing a bottle of wine and watching boats drift past. It felt like a date. A real date. The kind Tom hadn't experienced in years. Afterward, they walked to the lighthouse. The climb was harder than Tom remembered, his knees protesting with each step. But Margaret was patient, pausing when he needed to rest, never making him feel old or slow. At the top, they stood together looking out over the Atlantic. The wind was strong, carrying the salt smell of the sea. Margaret's hair whipped around her face, silver strands catching the sunlight. "Thank you for this," she said. "For what?" "For today. For all of it. These past few months have been—" She paused, searching for the right word. Unexpected. Good unexpected or bad unexpected. She turned to look at him. The best kind of unexpected. Tom felt his heart swell, and immediately fear followed, because moments like this were exactly when things fell apart, when he started believing that maybe this time will be different, that maybe she was the one who would stay. He had believed that before. He had been wrong. They descended the lighthouse as the afternoon faded toward evening. The pier was crowded with families setting up blankets and lawn chairs for the fireworks display. Tom and Margaret found a bench away from the main crowd, close enough to see the show but far enough to have some privacy. The sun sank lower. The sky turned shades of purple and gold. Around them, children ran and laughed, their sparklers leaving trails of light in the gathering darkness. Margaret sat close to him, closer than usual, her shoulder touching his. Her presence warm and steady. Tom's heart was racing. He had to tell her. He knew that now. If this was going to be real, if they were going to have any chance at a future, she needed to know the truth. All of it, before things went any further. The fear was overwhelming. Every instinct told him to stay silent, to enjoy what he had for as long as it lasted, to not ruin this perfect evening with the weight of his confession. But Tom was tired of silence, tired of hiding, tired of waiting for the inevitable collapse. If she was going to leave, he wanted to know now, before he fell any deeper, before the loss became unbearable. Margaret! His voice sounded strange in his own ears, thick and uncertain. She turned to look at him. Yes. There's something I need to tell you. The words hung in the air between them. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. A subtle alertness, a quiet bracing. Okay, she said softly. Tom looked out at the ocean. He couldn't face her. Not for this. There's a reason things haven't worked out for me. Since Eleanor, a reason that women leave. He paused, gathering himself. In the distance, the first firework exploded, a burst of red against the darkening sky. Cheers rose from the crowd. It's not something I did, not something I said. It's something about me, about my body. Another pause, another firework. Blue this time, spreading across the sky like a flower blooming. I was born different, physically different, in a way that most women find overwhelming, frightening, even. I've spent my whole adult life being reduced to this one thing. This thing I can't control, can't change, can't hide. He felt Margaret shift beside him but still couldn't look at her. Eleanor was the only woman who ever accepted it. Accepted me. After she died, I tried to move on. I really tried. But every time things got serious, every time the truth came out, they left, every single one of them. His voice cracked. He hated how vulnerable he sounded, how exposed. Some of them were kind about it. They said the right things, made the right excuses. But the result was always the same. I would wake up alone, wondering what was wrong with me, why I couldn't just be normal. The fireworks continued overhead, explosions of color that Tom barely registered. His entire being was focused on the woman beside him, waiting for her reaction, waiting for the silence that always preceded goodbye. I'm telling you this because I care about you, Margaret, more than I've cared about anyone since Eleanor. And I couldn't live with myself if I let things go further without you knowing the truth. You deserve honesty, even if that honesty cost me everything. He finally turned to look at her. Margaret's face was calm, unreadable. Her eyes glistened in the reflected light of the fireworks, but he couldn't tell if it was emotion or just the brightness overhead. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. An eternity. Then she spoke. Is that really why they left, Tom? He blinked. What? Is that really why those women left? Because of your body? Or is that just a story you've been telling yourself? Tom felt confusion replace fear. This wasn't the reaction he had expected. Not even close. I don't understand. Margaret turned her body toward him, taking his hand in both of his. Her grip was firm and warm. I've been listening to you for months now. Listening to how you talk about yourself. About your past. About what you think you deserve. And what I hear is a man who has convinced himself that is unlovable. That there's something fundamentally wrong with him. That no woman could possibly accept him as he is. Because that's what happened. Every time. Did it? Or did something else happen that you couldn't see? Tom shook his head. I was there. I know what happened. You know what you experienced. But experience isn't always truth. Margaret paused, her thumb tracing circles on the back of his hand. Did any of those women take the time to know you? Really know you? Before things became physical? Tom thought about it. Dolores, Patricia, the others. Their faces blurred together in his memory. I thought they did. But did they? Or were they just going through the motions? Looking for something easy? Something simple? He didn't have an answer. Tom. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. I'm not going to pretend that what you've told me doesn't matter. It does, but not in the way you think. What matters isn't your body. What matters is that you trusted me enough to be honest about it. She squeezed his hand. Let's take this one day at a time. No pressure. No expectations. Just two people figuring things out together. Can you do that? Tom felt something break open inside him, a dam that had been holding back years of pain and fear and loneliness. His eyes burned with tears he refused to shed. You're not leaving. I'm not leaving. But why? Everyone else. I'm not everyone else. She said it simply, without drama or emphasis. A statement of fact. Tom stared at her. The fireworks finale exploded overhead, a cascade of colors and sounds that transformed the night sky into chaos and beauty. Margaret didn't look up. Her eyes stayed fixed on his face. I don't understand, he whispered. You don't have to understand. Not tonight. Just accept that I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere. She leaned in and kissed his cheek, a soft, brief touch that left his skin tingling. Now, she said, turning to look at the sky. Let's watch the rest of the show. Tom sat beside her, her hand still in his, watching colors explode against the darkness. His heart was pounding. His mind was racing. She hadn't left. For the first time in a decade, someone hadn't left. He should have felt relief, gratitude, joy. Instead, he felt something else. Something he couldn't quite name. Because Margaret had accepted too easily, too quickly. As if she had been prepared for his confession. As if nothing he said surprised her. As if she already knew. The thought nagged at him as the fireworks faded and the crowd began to disperse. It nagged at him as they walked back to their cars, hand in hand. It nagged at him as he drove back to Sarasota, alone with his thoughts in the dark. She already knew. But how? And if she knew, why hadn't she said anything? Tom pushed the questions aside. He was being paranoid. Looking for problems where none existed. Margaret had given him a gift tonight. The gift of acceptance. The gift of staying. He should be grateful. He was grateful. But the questions remained. And deep in his gut, Tom knew that the real truth hadn't been revealed yet. Not his truth. Hers. August brought more heat and more questions. Tom saw Margaret twice a week now. Sometimes more. The book club meetings continued, but they had become almost incidental. An excuse to make the 2-hour drive, a reason to spend time in the town that was starting to feel like home. Their relationship deepened. Dinners lasted longer. Conversations went further. They held hands openly now, no longer self-conscious about public displays of affection. Margaret laughed more. Tom smiled more. People who knew them commented on how happy they seemed. And Tom was happy. Genuinely happy. Happier than he had been in years. But the questions wouldn't leave him alone. He noticed things. Small things that might have meant nothing but that accumulated in his mind like stones in a pocket. Margaret still never invited him to her home. When he asked about it, she changed the subject with practiced ease. Her apartment was a mess, she said. She was embarrassed by her decorating. The building was noisy. Always an excuse. Never an invitation. She still deflected questions about her marriage. Tom knew the basics. 28 years. Unhappy ending. Difficult divorce. But whenever he pressed for details, she steered the conversation elsewhere. What had gone wrong? Why had she stayed so long? What had finally pushed her to leave? These questions remained unanswered. And there was still that hesitation. That subtle flinch whenever he mentioned Eleanor. As if hearing about his late wife caused Margaret some kind of pain she was trying to hide. Tom told himself he was being unfair. Everyone had boundaries. Everyone had parts of themselves they weren't ready to share. He had spent months hiding his own truth. He had no right to demand that Margaret reveal hers before she was ready. But the feeling persisted. The sense that something important was being left unsaid. Labor Day weekend arrived. A friend of Margaret's was hosting a small gathering at her home in Jacksonville. A casual party. Older couples. Good food. Nothing fancy. Tom was nervous about meeting Margaret's friends. It felt significant. A step forward in their relationship. A sign that she was ready to integrate him into her life. The drive to Jacksonville took 90 minutes. Margaret sat beside him in the passenger seat, giving directions and pointing out landmarks along the way. She seemed relaxed, happy, whatever secret she might be keeping. They didn't seem to weigh on her today. The party was exactly as described. About 20 people gathered in a modest suburban home with a backyard pool. Most were around Tom and Margaret's age. Retirees enjoying their golden years. Couples who had been together for decades and singles who had learned to be comfortable alone. Tom found himself relaxing as the afternoon wore on. The people were friendly. The conversation was easy. He stood by the grill talking to a man named Frank about fishing while Margaret chatted with a group of women by the pool. For a few hours, everything felt normal. Easy. Right. Then she appeared. Tom was getting a fresh drink from the cooler when a woman's voice cut through the ambient noise of the party. Tom? Tom Callahan. He turned. A woman stood a few feet away, studying him with obvious recognition. She was in her early 60s, well-dressed, with carefully styled hair and calculating eyes. "It is you," she said. "I almost didn't recognize you. You've aged well." Tom searched his memory. The face was familiar, but he couldn't place it. "I'm sorry, have we met?" Diane Morrison. We dated. Must be 6 or 7 years ago now. You probably don't remember." The memory clicked into place. Diane. 3 dates. A nice woman who had seemed interested until she wasn't. She had stopped returning his calls without explanation. He had assumed she was like the others. "Of course," he said carefully. "How are you, Diane?" "I'm wonderful. Married now. 3rd time's a charm, they say." She laughed at her own joke. "I heard you were seeing someone. News travels fast in these circles." "I am. Margaret Lewis. She's here somewhere." "Oh, I know Margaret. Everyone knows Margaret." Diane's smile turned knowing. Something sly crept into her expression. "She's quite something, isn't she? Very understanding." Tom felt a chill despite the Florida heat. "What do you mean by that?" "Nothing. Just that Margaret has a reputation for being accepting. Of all kinds of men. Even the unusual ones." The words landed like punches. Tom felt his face flush. "I should get back to the party," he said stiffly. "Of course. It was lovely seeing you, Tom. You two make quite the pair." She walked away, leaving Tom standing by the cooler, his drink forgotten in his hand. His heart was pounding. His mind was racing. What had Diane meant? Was she just being cruel, dredging up old embarrassments? Or was there something more to her words? Margaret has a reputation for being accepting of all kinds of men, even the unusual ones. The implication was clear. Diane knew about Tom, knew his secret, and she seemed to think that Margaret knew too, had known all along. Tom spent the rest of the party in a fog. He smiled when required, made small talk when approached, but his attention kept drifting to Margaret, watching her laugh and chat as if nothing was wrong. Had she known before he told her? Had she sought him out specifically because she knew? And if so, why? The questions burned. By the time they left the party, the sun was setting. Tom drove in silence, his hands tight on the steering wheel. Margaret seemed to sense his mood. She made a few attempts at conversation, then fell quiet, watching the scenery pass. They were 20 minutes from St. Augustine when she finally spoke. "Something's wrong." It wasn't a question. Tom kept his eyes on the road. "I ran into someone at the party. Diane Morrison. I saw you talking to her. She said some things. About me. About you." Silence. Tom glanced at Margaret. Her face had gone still. "What kind of things?" "She implied that you knew about me. About my situation. Before I told you. She made it sound like you sought me out specifically because of it." More silence. The car hummed along the highway. Night was falling around them. "Is it true?" Tom asked. "Did you know before I told you?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "Pull over." "What?" "Pull over. Please. We need to talk, and I don't want to do it while you're driving." Tom found a rest stop a few miles ahead and parked in a spot away from the other cars. He killed the engine and sat in the darkness, waiting. Margaret took a deep breath. "I knew," she said. "Before you told me, I already knew." Tom felt the words hit him like a physical blow. He had suspected, he had feared, but hearing it confirmed was different. How? St. Augustine is a small town. People talk. When you started coming to the book club, when you started spending time with me, people noticed. And some of them remembered things. Stories about a man from Sarasota. Rumors that had made the rounds years ago. "So you sought me out? Because of what you heard?" "No." Margaret turned to face him. Even in the dim light, he could see the intensity in her eyes. "I sought you out because of who you seemed to be. The rumors came later, after I already liked you. But you didn't say anything. You let me struggle through that confession. Let me believe I was telling you something you didn't know. Because your telling mattered. Don't you see that? It wasn't about the information. It was about the trust. You chose to be vulnerable with me. You chose to be honest. That meant more than anything I might have heard from gossips." Tom shook his head, trying to process. "I don't understand. Why would anyone want to be with someone like me, after hearing those things?" "Tom," Margaret's voice cracked, "I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you months ago." She paused, collecting herself. When she continued, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My marriage, the one I don't like to talk about, it wasn't just unhappy. It was destructive. My husband, he used intimacy as a weapon. He made me feel afraid in my own body. For 28 years, I associated physical closeness with pain, with control, with fear." Tom listened in stunned silence. "When I finally left him, I thought I would never be with anyone again. I thought that part of my life was over. And honestly, I was relieved. The idea of intimacy made me feel sick. I couldn't imagine trusting anyone enough to be vulnerable like that again." She reached across the console and took his hand. "Then I met you, and I heard the rumors. And do you know what I felt? Relief, because you weren't looking for something physical. You were afraid of it too, for different reasons than me, but still afraid. I thought maybe, with you, I could have companionship without pressure, connection without fear. So you used me." "No." The word came out fierce. "I fell in love with you. I didn't plan to. I didn't want to. But somewhere along the way, the companionship became more. You became more. And I realized that what I thought I wanted wasn't what I needed." Tom felt tears streaming down his face. He hadn't noticed when they started. "I accepted you not despite your truth," Margaret continued. "I accepted you because of it. Because your honesty showed me that you were different from my husband. Different from any man I'd ever known. You didn't hide behind bravado. You didn't pretend to be something you weren't. You came to me as you are, flaws and fears and all." She squeezed his hand. "That's why I stayed, Tom. Not because of rumors or reputations. Because you were brave enough to be yourself. And that made me brave enough to try again." They sat in silence as the night deepened around them. Tom felt the fear that had gripped him for so long slowly begin to loosen. "All those women who left," he said finally, "I thought it was because of me. Because of my body. Some of them, maybe, but most of them, they left because of their own fears, their own limitations. It had nothing to do with you, and everything to do with what they couldn't handle in themselves." Tom thought about this, about all the rejections he had internalized, all the shame he had carried, all the years he had spent believing he was broken. "I've been fighting the wrong enemy," he said slowly. "We both have." He looked at her, really looked at her, not as a potential partner or a possible rejection, but as a person, a wounded, brave, imperfect person who had chosen to take a chance on him. "What happens now?" he asked. "I don't know. We figure it out, one day at a time. Like I said. And if it doesn't work, if we can't overcome our fears, then at least we tried. At least we didn't let the fear win without a fight." Tom nodded slowly. Something had shifted inside him. The fear was still there, but it felt smaller now, less consuming, like a storm that had finally begun to pass. He leaned across the console and took Margaret's face in his hands. She tensed for a moment, then relaxed. "I'm scared," he admitted. "So am I. But I want to try." "So do I." He kissed her, softly at first, then deeper. She kissed him back, her hands finding his shoulders, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "Take me home," Margaret said. "You're home." She smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her all evening. "Yes, my home. It's time." Tom started the car and pulled back onto the highway. Beside him, Margaret reached over and laced her fingers through his. The road ahead was dark, but for the first time in a decade, Tom felt like he knew where he was going. December arrived soft and quiet. The heat of summer had faded into something gentler. Cool mornings, warm afternoons, the kind of Florida winter that tourists dreamed about and locals took for granted. St. Augustine transformed for the holidays. Lights wrapped around palm trees and draped across Spanish balconies. The old fort glowed at night, illuminated by thousands of tiny bulbs. Carolers sang in the plaza. The air smelled of cinnamon and salt. Tom had moved to St. Augustine in October. It wasn't a dramatic decision, no grand gesture or romantic declaration. He simply realized one morning that Sarasota felt empty and St. Augustine felt like home. So he packed his modest belongings, sold what he didn't need, and rented a small apartment 3 blocks from the waterfront. Margaret had offered to let him stay with her. He had declined, not because he didn't want to be close to her, but because he understood that some things needed time. They had both spent decades building walls around themselves. Those walls wouldn't come down overnight, but they were coming down, slowly, carefully, one brick at a time. Tom spent his mornings walking along the harbor, watching fishing boats head out to sea. He spent his afternoons reading in cafes or volunteering at the local community center, helping wherever he was needed. He spent his evenings with Margaret. Sometimes they cooked dinner together at her apartment. Sometimes they ate out at restaurants they were slowly making their own. Sometimes they just sat on their bench overlooking the Atlantic, watching the waves and saying nothing at all. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer heavy with unspoken fears, no longer thick with secrets waiting to be revealed. Now it was comfortable, peaceful, the silence of 2 people who had learned to trust each other with their imperfections. Their relationship wasn't perfect. Tom never expected it to be. Some nights were still cautious. Margaret would tense at unexpected touches, her body remembering traumas that her mind was trying to forget. Tom would feel the old shame creep in, the voice that whispered he was too much, that he would eventually drive her away. But they talked about these things now, named them, faced them together. "I had a bad dream last night," Margaret told him one morning over coffee. "About Richard, about the way things used to be." Tom reached across the table and took her hand. "Do you want to talk about it?" "Not really, but I wanted you to know, in case I seem distant today. Thank you for telling me." That was a difference. The willingness to be seen. The courage to be honest even when honesty was hard. Tom was learning that love wasn't about being perfect. It was about being present. Showing up day after day, even when showing up was difficult. Choosing each other despite the baggage they carried. Margaret was teaching him that. And he hoped he was teaching her too. On a Tuesday afternoon in mid-December, Tom drove to Columbus. He hadn't been back since Eleanor's funeral. Had avoided the city and everything it represented. The memories were too painful. The grave was too final. But something had shifted. The pain was still there, but it no longer controlled him. He could hold it now without being consumed by it. The cemetery was quiet. A light rain was falling, turning the grass soft beneath his feet. Tom walked the familiar path without needing to think about it, his body remembering what his mind had tried to forget. Eleanor's headstone was simple. Just her name, the date, and a small inscription they had chosen together years before she died. Beloved wife, faithful heart. Tom stood before it, hands in his pockets, rain dampening his hair. "Hey, Ellie." His voice sounded strange in the silence, older than he remembered. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come back. I wasn't ready before. Couldn't face it. Couldn't face you, I guess. Or the memories. or the life we were supposed to have. He paused, watching rain collect on the granite. I met someone. Her name is Margaret. She's good, Ellie, kind, patient. She makes me laugh. She makes me feel like myself again, like the person I was before I forgot who that was. A bird called somewhere in the distance. Tom wiped rain from his eyes. I spent so many years thinking something was wrong with me, that the way I was born made me unlovable, that you were the only one who could ever accept me. And when you died, I thought that part of my life was over. He shook his head slowly. I was wrong. About all of it. It wasn't my body that drove people away. It was a fear, mine and theirs. The inability to be honest. The unwillingness to be vulnerable. He touched the headstone gently. You taught me how to love, Ellie, how to be loved. But I forgot. After you left, I forgot. I let the fear take over. Let the shame define me. And I missed so many years because of it. The rain was falling harder now. Tom didn't mind. Margaret isn't you. She never will be. And I'm not trying to replace you. I couldn't even if I wanted to. But she's shown me that my heart still works. That I'm still capable of connection, of trust, of hope. He smiled despite the tears streaming down his face. I think you'd like her. I think you'd be happy for me. And I hope, wherever you are, you know that I never stopped loving you. Never will. But I'm ready to live again. Really live, not just exist in the margins, waiting for something to change. He leaned down and kissed the cold stone. Goodbye, Ellie. Thank you for everything. I'll carry you with me. Always. Tom stood for a long moment, letting the rain wash over him. Then he turned and walked back to his car, leaving the cemetery behind. He didn't look back. Christmas Eve found Tom and Margaret on their bench. The waterfront was decorated for the holidays. Lights reflected off the dark water. A live band played carols somewhere in the distance. Families strolled past, children bundled in coats they rarely needed in Florida. Tom and Margaret sat close together, sharing a blanket against the evening chill. Her head rested on his shoulder, his arm wrapped around her waist. I went to see Eleanor, he said quietly. Margaret lifted her head. When? Last week. I needed to say goodbye, really say goodbye. How was it? Hard, but necessary. He paused. I told her about you. Margaret smiled. What did you say? That you make me laugh. That you make me feel like myself. That I'm grateful for every day we have together. She leaned up and kissed his cheek. I'm grateful too. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the lights dance on the water. You know what I've learned? Tom said finally. What? That the things we think make us unlovable are often the things that lead us to the right person. I spent decades hiding, ashamed of who I was, convinced that no one could accept me. But that shame led me here, to this town, to that book club, to you. Margaret took his hand. We find each other, don't we? The broken ones, the scared ones. We recognize something in each other. And we stay. Yes, we stay. The band in the distance shifted to a slower song. Something about coming home for the holidays. About finding your way back to where you belong. Tom looked at Margaret. At her silver hair catching the Christmas lights. At her eyes, warm and steady. At the woman who had seen his worst fears and chosen to stay anyway. I love you, he said. It was the first time he had spoken the words. He hadn't planned to say them. They had simply arrived, natural and true. Margaret's eyes glistened. I love you too. They kissed, soft and slow. Not the kiss of new lovers, but of old souls who had finally found each other. When they pulled apart, Margaret rested her head on his shoulder again. So what happens now? She asked. I don't know. We keep taking it one day at a time, I suppose. That sounds perfect. The night deepened around them. The crowds thinned. The music faded. But Tom and Margaret remained on their bench, wrapped in each other and in the peace they had owned. Some loves arrive early and burn bright and fast. Others arrive late and burn slow and steady. Tom had experienced both. He had loved fiercely and lost completely. He had wandered through years of loneliness and shame. But here, on this bench, beside this woman, he finally understood what Eleanor had known all along. Love doesn't require perfection. It requires presence. It requires honesty. It requires the courage to show up as you are and trust that someone will meet you there. Tom had spent his whole life believing that what made him different was his burden to carry alone. Now he knew the truth. What made him different was the very thing that led him to someone brave enough to stay. And that was where the real story began. Some stories end with answers. This one ends with a question. How many years do we lose hiding the part of ourselves we think no one could love? Tom spent decades believing his body was a problem, that the thing he was born with made him unworthy of connection, unworthy of intimacy, unworthy of love. He was wrong. The real barrier was never physical. It was silence, shame, the fear of being seen and rejected. Margaret taught him that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's a door through which love finally enters. And love, when it arrives late, isn't lesser. Sometimes it's deeper, wiser, more patient. We don't get to choose the timing of love. We only get to choose whether we show up for it, whether we stay, whether we let ourselves be known. Tom stayed. Margaret stayed. And in staying, they found something neither expected. A second chance. If you've ever loved quietly, if you ever carried something you were afraid to say, if you ever wondered whether it's too late to start again, this channel is for you. Stay with us. There are more stories to tell.